a name that shook continents, a man who didn't lead a single nation, but an idea. Simón Bolívar. Some called him El Libertador, others saw him as the architect of an unfinished revolution. But everyone agrees on one thing: whenever his name is spoken, the fate of South America shifts. This story begins with a child born into wealth and privilege, who chose to devote everything to the idea of freedom. Exposed to revolutionary ideas in Europe and harsh realities back in the Americas, Bolívar dreamed of a continent breaking its chains. For him, independence was not merely a goal, it was almost a sacred duty. And that duty dragged him into years of war, betrayal, and endless marches across mountains and jungles. He won victories, shattered empires, and laid the foundations of new states. Yet after every triumph came a new crisis, and behind every promise of freedom emerged fresh chaos. The united and powerful America Bolívar imagined was tested by internal conflicts, power struggles, and deep disappointment. Even in the lands he liberated, he often stood alone. This documentary does not present a heroic legend, but the cost of an ideal. It shows how a struggle born from hope can end in exhaustion and solitude, and how great ideas can both elevate and consume those who carry them. Because the story of Simón Bolívar reminds us how difficult, how fragile, and how costly freedom truly is. Simón Bolívar was born in 1783 into one of the most privileged families of colonial Caracas, a society rigidly structured by birth, wealth, and imperial authority. His family belonged to the Creole aristocracy, locally born elites of Spanish descent who controlled land, slaves, and commerce, yet remained politically subordinate to officials sent from Spain. From the very beginning, Bolívar's world was defined by contradiction, immense local power paired with political exclusion. This imbalance, quietly embedded in daily life, formed the background against which his earliest experiences unfolded. His childhood, however, was marked by loss as much as privilege. Bolívar lost both parents at a young age, leaving him to be raised by relatives, tutors, and enslaved caretakers within the family household. This early exposure to instability disrupted the protections normally afforded by aristocratic life. Surrounded by wealth yet emotionally unanchored, he developed a restless temperament and a deep sensitivity to authority and dependence. The absence of parental guidance did not soften him. Instead, it sharpened his independence and resistance to control, traits that would later define his leadership. Education during these years reflected both elite expectation and personal tension. Bolívar received instruction from private tutors who introduced him to classical learning, European thought, and the values of honour and duty expected of his class. Yet he resisted rigid discipline, often clashing with instructors and guardians. At the same time, life within a slave-owning household exposed him to stark social hierarchies. He witnessed inequality not as abstraction, but as routine, embedded in labour, language, and obedience. These experiences planted early, unarticulated questions about power and legitimacy long before he could frame them politically. By 1799, Bolívar stood at the threshold of youth, shaped by privilege, loss, and contradiction. He had inherited wealth and status, yet lacked emotional security. He had been trained for leadership, yet felt constrained by imposed authority. His aristocratic origins did not bind him comfortably to the colonial order, they unsettled him within it. These formative years did not yet produce a revolutionary vision, but they forged the psychological foundations of one. Bolívar emerged from childhood not as a content heir of empire, but as a restless figure poised between inheritance and rebellion, carrying within him the unresolved tensions of a society approaching transformation. Simón Bolívar's education unfolded across two very different worlds, each leaving a lasting imprint on his character and imagination. In Venezuela, his early instruction followed the model reserved for elite Creole youth: private tutors, classical subjects, and an emphasis on manners suitable for leadership. Yet this education was uneven and often interrupted. Bolívar was intelligent but impatient, resistant to rigid authority, and easily bored by rote learning. What distinguished him even then was not academic discipline, but intensity, a restless curiosity that sought meaning beyond formal lessons. A decisive shift came when his education was guided by mentors who encouraged independent thought rather than obedience. Exposure to literature, history, and philosophy began to awaken a deeper intellectual hunger. Instead of simply absorbing inherited values, Bolívar started to question them. The contrast between the ideals taught in books and the realities of colonial society, inequality, exclusion, and imposed hierarchy, became increasingly visible. Education for him was no longer about refinement alone. It was becoming a lens through which the world itself could be examined and judged. His move to Europe expanded this transformation dramatically. In Spain, and later across the continent, Bolívar encountered societies shaped by different political traditions and intellectual currents. The Enlightenment was no longer a distant concept, but a living influence, visible in salons, books, and public debate. He absorbed ideas about liberty, sovereignty, and the rights of nations, not as abstract theory, but as forces already reshaping Europe. Travel exposed him to empires in tension and monarchies under pressure, revealing that political order was neither eternal nor unquestionable. Europe also educated Bolívar through experience rather than study alone. He witnessed power exercised in both refined and brutal forms, saw the fragility of authority, and observed how ideas could mobilize entire populations. These impressions left a deeper mark than any classroom. By the time his education in Europe drew to a close, Bolívar was no longer simply a young aristocrat completing his formation. He had become a man intellectually unmoored from colonial certainty, armed with ideas that challenged inherited loyalty and inspired ambition. Education had not given him answers. It had given him direction, preparing him for a life defined by action rather than inheritance. Simón Bolívar's early exposure to Enlightenment ideas marked a quiet but decisive rupture with the intellectual world into which he had been born. These ideas did not reach him as slogans or revolutionary manifestos, but as fragments, books, conversations, and examples encountered gradually through education and travel. At first, they existed alongside older values of honour, hierarchy, and obedience. Over time, however, they began to challenge those values from within, introducing a new way of thinking about authority, legitimacy, and the individual's place in society. What struck Bolívar most powerfully in Enlightenment thought was its insistence that power required justification. Philosophers who argued that sovereignty derived from the people, not divine right or inherited rank, offered a framework radically different from the colonial order he had always known. Concepts such as natural rights, social contracts, and civic equality unsettled assumptions that had once seemed fixed. For Bolívar, these ideas were not purely intellectual exercises. They resonated with his personal experience of contradiction, belonging to an elite class that held local power yet remained politically subordinate to distant imperial rule. Exposure to these ideas also sharpened his sense of historical possibility. Enlightenment thinkers presented history not as a static chain of obedience, but as a process shaped by human choice and reason. This perspective suggested that societies could be redesigned, not merely endured. Bolívar began to see political systems as creations rather than destinies, subject to reform or replacement when they failed to serve justice. This shift was crucial. It transformed dissatisfaction into imagination and grievance into ambition, allowing him to conceive of independence as something achievable rather than unthinkable. Importantly, Bolívar did not absorb Enlightenment ideas uncritically. He wrestled with their limits, particularly when applying European theories to the complex realities of Latin American society. Issues of race, social hierarchy, and political unity raised questions that abstract philosophy could not easily resolve. Yet the core lesson endured. Authority must answer to reason, and freedom required conscious effort. Early exposure to Enlightenment thought did not make Bolívar a revolutionary overnight, but it altered the direction of his thinking permanently. It gave him a language for resistance and a moral framework for action, tools that would later shape not only his leadership, but the political imagination of an entire continent. Simón Bolívar's travels in Europe became the true turning point of his political awakening, transforming abstract ideas into lived conviction. Europe was not simply a destination for refinement or leisure, it was a stage on which power, collapse, and transformation played out in real time. As Bolívar moved through Spain, France, and Italy, he encountered societies shaped by revolution, reaction, and ambition. The continent itself felt unstable, charged with the sense that old orders were being tested and new ones imagined. For a young man raised in a colonial world defined by permanence and hierarchy, this atmosphere was profoundly unsettling and deeply illuminating. In France, the legacy of revolution was impossible to ignore. Even after the most turbulent years had passed, the memory of mass mobilization and political rupture lingered in public life. Bolívar observed how ideas could overturn monarchies and reshape identities, not gradually, but with explosive force. Streets, monuments, and conversations all carried traces of recent upheaval. This exposure taught him that political authority was not sacred or invulnerable. It could be challenged, resisted, and even destroyed when it lost legitimacy. Europe showed him that history could move quickly and violently when conditions aligned. Italy added a different dimension to his awakening. Surrounded by the ruins of ancient republics and empires, Bolívar confronted the long arc of political rise and decay. The past was no longer distant or abstract. It stood visibly alongside the present. These landscapes reinforced a powerful lesson. Domination was temporary, and greatness was fragile. Empires that once appeared eternal had collapsed into memory. For Bolívar, this realization struck deeply. If Rome could fall, so could Spain's colonial rule. History, he now understood, offered both warning and permission. Simón Bolívar's Oath of Monte Sacro stands as one of the most symbolic moments of his life, a private vow that carried the weight of a continent's future. The scene unfolded in 1805 on the Aventine Hill in Rome, a place saturated with historical meaning. Known in antiquity as Monte Sacro, it was associated with popular resistance and the assertion of civic rights in ancient Rome. For Bolívar, this was not a casual stop during his travels, but a deliberate encounter with history, chosen as the setting for an inner transformation. Standing among the ruins of past republics and empires, Bolívar confronted the lessons of history in their most tangible form. Rome represented both greatness and collapse, freedom and domination. In this setting, he reflected on the fate of his own homeland, still bound by colonial rule and distant authority. The contrast between Europe's shattered empires and Latin America's enforced obedience sharpened his sense of injustice. Monte Sacro became a mirror, showing him that political orders, no matter how powerful, were neither eternal nor immune to challenge. It was here that Bolívar pronounced his famous oath, a solemn promise that he would not rest until his homeland was free. This was not a public declaration or a political manifesto. There was no audience, no applause, no immediate consequence. Its power lay precisely in its privacy. The oath bound Bolívar not to others, but to himself. In that moment, ambition hardened into obligation. Freedom ceased to be an idea he admired and became a task he accepted, regardless of cost or outcome. The significance of the Oath of Monte Sacro lies not in its dramatic setting alone, but in what followed. Bolívar did not immediately return to lead armies or organize revolutions. Instead, the oath worked slowly, shaping decisions, sharpening resolve, and providing a moral anchor during moments of doubt. It transformed his political awakening into a lifelong commitment. From that day forward, independence was no longer a possibility. It was a duty. Monte Sacro thus marks the point where reflection became destiny, and where a young aristocrat consciously stepped onto the path of revolutionary leadership, guided not by impulse, but by a promise he would spend the rest of his life trying to fulfill. Simón Bolívar's return to Venezuela marked the collision between revolutionary vision and colonial reality. When he arrived back in Caracas, he carried with him ideas forged abroad and a private vow that now demanded action. Yet the society he re-entered was cautious, fragmented, and uncertain. Colonial authority still appeared intact, and many among the Creole's elite hesitated to risk status and security for an uncertain future. Bolívar quickly realized that awakening a desire for independence would be far more difficult than imagining it. The first revolutionary efforts unfolded in an atmosphere of instability rather than open rebellion. Events in Europe, particularly the weakening of Spanish authority, created cracks in the imperial structure, and local political debate intensified. Bolívar immersed himself in these discussions, aligning with reform-minded figures who questioned the legitimacy of colonial rule. His role at this stage was not military, but ideological. He spoke, argued, and persuaded, pushing beyond cautious reform toward the more dangerous idea of full independence. This urgency set him apart from moderates who still hoped for autonomy without rupture. When revolutionary action finally emerged, it did so unevenly and without preparation. Early attempts to reshape authority revealed how fragile unity truly was. Bolívar encountered hesitation, rivalry, and fear, not only among opponents of independence, but among its supporters. Resources were scarce, leadership inexperienced, and popular support inconsistent. These first efforts exposed a harsh truth. Liberation would not be achieved through enthusiasm alone. The gap between revolutionary ideals and practical execution became painfully clear, forcing Bolívar to confront failure early in his political life. Yet these initial setbacks did not extinguish his resolve. On the contrary, they refined it. Bolívar learned that independence would require discipline, sacrifice, and endurance, far beyond what he had imagined during his years of reflection. The return to Venezuela stripped his ideas of abstraction and bound them to consequence. Though the first revolutionary efforts faltered, they mark the true beginning of his public struggle. Bolívar emerged from this period not discouraged, but hardened, aware now that freedom would not be granted by history but seized through persistence, learning, and relentless commitment. Simón Bolívar witnessed the collapse of the First Venezuelan Republic as a harsh lesson in the costs of premature revolution. What had begun with hope and political experimentation quickly unravelled under the pressure of war, internal division, and fragile institutions. The new republic lacked the administrative experience, military coordination, and social unity needed to survive sustained crisis. Instead of consolidating authority, it struggled to define it, leaving power dispersed and responsibility unclear at the very moment decisive leadership was most needed. One of the Republic's greatest weaknesses lay in its internal fractures. Revolutionary leaders disagreed sharply over the pace and scope of change, while regional loyalties undermined central control. Many sectors of society remained indifferent or openly hostile to independence, seeing little benefit in replacing one distant authority with another unstable regime. The population was divided by class, race, and economic interest, and the Republic failed to transform revolutionary ideals into a shared national purpose. In this atmosphere, loyalty was fragile and commitment uneven. External pressures compounded these internal failures. Royalist forces exploited disorder with ruthless efficiency, advancing against poorly coordinated Republican defences. Natural disasters, economic breakdown, and shortages further weakened morale. Authority shifted rapidly from civil institutions to emergency measures, eroding public confidence in Republican governance. For Bolívar, these events revealed a devastating truth. Independence without discipline could collapse as quickly as it was declared. The Republic fell not only to its enemies, but to its own unpreparedness. The collapse marked a moment of reckoning for Bolívar. Forced into retreat, he reflected intensely on the causes of failure. He concluded that liberty could not survive without strong leadership, unity, and military resolve. Idealism, he now believed, had to be matched by authority capable of enforcing order in times of chaos. This realization did not weaken his commitment to independence, it hardened it. The fall of the First Venezuelan Republic became a crucible in which Bolívar's revolutionary identity was reshaped, transforming him from a passionate advocate into a leader determined to rebuild the struggle on firmer ground, guided by experience rather than illusion. Simón Bolívar's exile marked one of the most introspective and decisive periods of his life. Forced away from his homeland after the collapse of the revolutionary experiment, he entered exile not as a defeated man, but as a leader compelled to confront uncomfortable truths. Distance stripped away urgency and illusion alike. Removed from command and immediate danger, Bolívar faced the failure of his first efforts with clarity, recognizing that the struggle for independence required deeper understanding rather than renewed impulse. During this period, exile became a space for political reassessment rather than resignation. Bolívar carefully examined the reasons behind defeat, refusing to attribute failure solely to enemy strength or chance. He identified internal division, weak authority, and the absence of disciplined leadership as decisive factors. The experience convinced him that liberty could not be sustained by enthusiasm alone. Political freedom, he now believed, required order, unity, and the willingness to enforce difficult decisions. This marked a significant evolution in his thinking, shifting him from idealistic republicanism toward a more pragmatic and centralized vision of power. Exile also expanded Bolívar's awareness of the international dimension of revolution. Moving through foreign territories, he observed how global politics shaped the fate of smaller nations. Sympathy existed, but intervention followed interests, not ideals. This realization hardened his resolve to rely less on external validation and more on internal strength. Independence would have to be achieved through perseverance and organization, not expectation of rescue. Bolívar began to see leadership as endurance, the capacity to sustain purpose when momentum vanished. Simón Bolívar's admirable campaign marked the moment when reflection turned decisively into action, and failure was answered with resolve. Launched in 1813, the campaign was born from exile, frustration, and hard-earned clarity. Bolívar no longer approached revolution as a fragile experiment. He treated it as a war for survival that demanded speed, discipline, and moral authority. With limited resources and a small but determined force, he crossed from New Granada into western Venezuela, carrying not only weapons but a renewed vision of leadership forged through defeat. The campaign unfolded with astonishing momentum. Moving rapidly through difficult terrain, Bolívar avoided prolonged sieges and instead relied on surprise, mobility, and psychological impact. Town after town fell as royalist forces, unprepared for the pace and coordination of the advance, retreated or collapsed. Bolívar presented himself not merely as a military commander, but as a liberator restoring dignity and order. His proclamations framed the campaign as a necessary response to repression, seeking to unite populations exhausted by instability and violence under a single decisive cause. Yet the admirable campaign was not only a military operation, it was a political statement. Bolívar had learned from earlier failure that hesitation bred chaos. Authority, he now believed, had to be visible and firm. He imposed discipline on his troops and demanded loyalty from liberated territories, making it clear that independence would not mean disorder. This approach won him both support and fear, but it restored coherence to a revolutionary movement that had previously fragmented under pressure. Leadership in this phase was inseparable from command. The capture of Caracas marked the campaign's symbolic climax. Bolívar entered the city not as an uncertain revolutionary, but as a figure transformed by experience. The admirable campaign did not end the struggle for independence, nor did it guarantee lasting stability. But it redefined Bolívar's role within it. He was no longer a promising ideologue shaped by Enlightenment ideals alone. He had become a commander capable of acting decisively in chaos. The campaign demonstrated that independence could be reclaimed through force, guided by purpose, and it confirmed Bolívar's emergence as the central figure of a revolution that now moved forward with clarity, authority, and renewed confidence. Simón Bolívar's liberation of New Granada marked a strategic and psychological breakthrough in the long struggle for independence. After years of reversals and fragile victories, Bolívar understood that lasting success required more than reclaiming territory. It required altering the balance of power. New Granada offered precisely that opportunity. Its geography, resources, and political significance made it the hinge upon which the wider war could turn. To liberate it was to secure a rear base, restore credibility, and demonstrate that independence was not a regional uprising, but a continental project. The campaign was audacious from the start. Bolívar chose speed and surprise over caution, leading his forces across harsh terrain that enemy commanders considered impassable. Marching through flooded plains and over the Andes, his army endured hunger, cold, and exhaustion. This movement was not merely logistical, it was psychological warfare. Royalist forces were caught off guard, their assumptions about distance and season shattered. The march itself became a declaration of intent. The revolution would advance where the empire believed it could not. Battle followed maneuver, and discipline followed hardship. Bolívar's leadership during this phase reflected lessons learned from earlier failures. Command was centralized, decisions decisive, and objectives clear. Victories accumulated not through overwhelming force, but through coordination and resolve. As towns and cities fell, the liberation of New Granada began to feel inevitable rather than improbable. Each success restored confidence among supporters and weakened the aura of imperial invincibility that had long protected royalist rule. The capture of key political centres transformed the campaign's meaning. New Granada's liberation provided the revolution with legitimacy, resources, and a secure platform from which to continue the war. It also reshaped Bolívar's standing. He emerged not just as a resilient commander, but as a strategist capable of envisioning independence on a continental scale. The liberation did not end the conflict, far from it, but it changed its direction. From this point forward, the struggle moved with momentum and purpose, guided by the understanding that independence would be achieved not by isolated victories, but by linking regions into a unified, enduring cause. Simón Bolívar's vision reached its most ambitious political expression with the creation of Gran Colombia. This was not merely a new state proclaimed in the aftermath of military victory, but a deliberate attempt to reshape the political future of North and South America. Bolívar believed that independence would remain fragile unless the liberated territories were bound together into a single political body, capable of resisting internal division and external pressure. Gran Colombia was conceived as a solution to the dangers he feared most: fragmentation, regional rivalry, and the return of imperial influence. The creation of Gran Colombia emerged from necessity as much as idealism. Years of war had revealed how easily isolated provinces could fall, how local interest could undermine collective goals. Bolívar concluded that unity was not optional, but essential. By joining Venezuela, New Granada, and later Ecuador into one republic, he sought to create a state large enough to command respect and stable enough to survive peace. This union was intended to channel revolutionary energy into durable institutions, replacing military improvisation with constitutional order. Yet the very scale of Gran Colombia exposed its inner tensions. Vast distances, regional identities, and competing political traditions strained the new republic from the start. Bolívar envisioned a strong central authority as the guarantor of unity, believing that premature federalism would invite chaos. Others, however, feared that centralization threatened local autonomy and replaced colonial domination with a new form of control. These disagreements were not abstract debates. They reflected lived realities across provinces shaped by different economies, cultures, and wartime experiences. Despite these challenges, the creation of Gran Colombia represented a moment of extraordinary possibility. For a brief time, it embodied Bolívar's belief that independence could lead not to division, but to collective strength. It stood as a declaration that the struggle against empire was not only about breaking chains, but about building something larger in their place. Though Gran Colombia would ultimately fracture, its creation remains one of Bolívar's most defining achievements, a bold attempt to turn revolutionary victory into political unity, and to imagine a future in which freedom was protected not by isolation, but by shared destiny. Simón Bolívar's assumption of extraordinary powers marked one of the most controversial phases of his career, when revolution gave way to governing crisis. As the wars of independence subsided, the political unity he had fought to create began to fracture under the weight of regional ambition, economic exhaustion, and ideological rivalry. Civil institutions were weak, constitutions contested, and loyalty increasingly divided along local lines. Faced with what he perceived as the imminent collapse of the state, Bolívar concluded that normal political mechanisms were no longer sufficient to preserve the republic he had helped to build. The move toward military dictatorship did not emerge from ambition for personal rule, but from fear of disintegration. Bolívar believed that disorder posed a greater threat to liberty than temporary concentration of power. In assuming near absolute authority, he framed his actions as emergency measures designed to stabilize the nation until unity could be secured. Yet this justification failed to reassure many former allies. To critics, the liberator now appeared to be replacing colonial domination with personal control, undermining the very republican ideals for which the wars had been fought. Political conflicts intensified rapidly. Federalists and regional leaders resisted central authority, accusing Bolívar of authoritarianism and betrayal. Debates over constitutional design became deeply personal, blending ideological disagreement with resentment accumulated during years of war. Assassination plots, rebellions, and open defiance revealed how fragile the post-independence order truly was. Bolívar, once a unifying symbol, found himself increasingly isolated, defending unity through force while watching popular support erode. Simón Bolívar's greatest battles after independence were no longer fought on open fields, but within the fragile political landscape he had helped to create. As the immediate threat of imperial rule faded, regional identities that had been temporarily united by war reasserted themselves with force. Provinces that had endured the struggle differently now demanded authority over their own affairs, questioning why unity should continue once the common enemy was gone. For Bolívar, this resurgence of regionalism represented a danger as serious as any foreign invasion. Internal opposition took many forms, from constitutional resistance to open defiance. Local leaders, deeply rooted in their own territories, feared that centralized authority would erase regional autonomy and replace colonial domination with a distant republican capital. These figures did not necessarily reject independence. They rejected Bolívar's vision of how it should be organized. Political debate quickly hardened into personal rivalry, and disagreements over administration, taxation, and military control became symbols of deeper mistrust. Unity, once a wartime necessity, now appeared to many as an imposed constraint. Bolívar struggled to respond to this opposition without betraying his own principles. He believed that fragmentation would invite foreign interference and internal collapse, yet every attempt to enforce cohesion intensified accusations of authoritarianism. Compromise often proved impossible. Regional elites viewed concession as weakness, while Bolívar viewed it as a step toward disintegration. Each rebellion or act of resistance confirmed his fear that the Republic lacked a shared political identity strong enough to survive peace. Leadership in this environment became an exercise in containment rather than inspiration. These struggles gradually isolated Bolívar from the very people he had liberated. Once celebrated as a unifying figure, he came to be seen by some as an obstacle to local self-rule. The emotional toll was profound. He watched the vision of continental unity erode under the weight of regional ambition and internal distrust. The conflict revealed a painful truth. Independence had ended empire, but it had not created consensus. Bolívar's struggle with regionalism stands as one of the most tragic dimensions of his legacy, a reminder that the hardest task of revolution is not victory, but sustaining unity once victory has been achieved. Simón Bolívar's final campaigns unfolded in an atmosphere far removed from the triumphs that had once defined his name. Though military threats still lingered, the greater struggle was now political and internal. Bolívar continued to move across vast territories, attempting to hold together a fragile order born of war and weakened by peace. Each campaign felt heavier than the last, driven less by hope than by obligation. Victory no longer promised renewal, it merely postponed collapse. The liberator pressed on, not because success seemed certain, but because withdrawal felt like surrender to fragmentation. During these years, illness began to shadow every decision. Physical exhaustion accumulated from decades of campaigning, harsh climates, and relentless travel. Symptoms that could no longer be ignored drained his strength and sharpened his sense of vulnerability. Yet Bolívar refused to step aside. Even as his health deteriorated, he continued to write, command, and intervene, convinced that his absence would accelerate disintegration. The contrast was stark. A man who had once crossed mountains with relentless energy now carried his authority through sheer force of will. Disillusionment deepened as political reality closed in. Bolívar watched allies turn into opponents, and ideals fracture under the pressure of ambition and mistrust. The unity he had envisioned seemed increasingly unattainable, not because of foreign enemies, but because of irreconcilable internal divisions. He came to believe that the societies he had helped free were not yet prepared for the institutions they demanded. This realization was not cynical, it was tragic. Bolívar did not renounce liberty, but he questioned whether it could survive without a shared civic spirit strong enough to sustain it. By the time his final campaigns ended, Bolívar was a man profoundly aware of the limits of his own achievement. Illness confined him, disappointment weighed on him, and exile loomed once more, this time from power, not from territory. His famous sense of destiny gave way to a quieter reckoning, that history does not always reward intention with fulfillment. Yet even in disillusionment, he did not regret the struggle itself. The final years stripped Bolívar of illusion, but not of conviction. They revealed the full cost of leadership, the loneliness of responsibility when vision outpaces reality, and the enduring burden of having dreamed not just of freedom, but of unity in a world determined to resist it. Simón Bolívar died in 1830 far from the power, unity, and admiration that had once surrounded his name. His final days were marked by physical weakness and emotional exhaustion, spent in quiet isolation rather than public honor. The man who had liberated vast territories and reshaped a continent's political map left the world without a nation to command or a state to embody his vision. Death came not as a dramatic climax, but as a subdued ending, almost anonymous in contrast to the scale of his ambition. Yet it was precisely this lonely end that began the transformation of Bolívar from historical figure into myth. In death, the contradictions of his life softened. Political failures, internal conflicts, and authoritarian episodes faded behind the memory of liberation. Nations that had once resisted his authority now claimed him as a founding symbol. Bolívar became less a man shaped by circumstance and more an idea, an embodiment of sacrifice, courage, and continental destiny. Myth simplified what history had complicated, turning struggle into legend and disappointment into prophecy. Over time, Bolívar's image expanded far beyond his actions. He was invoked as a moral authority, a revolutionary archetype, and a unifying father figure for societies still wrestling with identity and cohesion. Different generations reshaped him to meet their needs, as a champion of a liberty, a warning against fragmentation, or a symbol of resistance to foreign domination. This adaptability ensured his survival in collective memory, but it also blurred the human cost of his journey, the doubt, isolation, and unfinished hopes that defined his final years. Historically, Bolívar's legacy rests not on perfect outcomes, but on irreversible transformation. He did not deliver lasting unity, but he dismantled empire. He did not leave stable institutions behind, but he altered political imagination forever. His life demonstrated both the power and the limits of revolutionary leadership. In the end, Bolívar endures not because he succeeded in everything he sought, but because he dared to envision freedom on a continental scale. Death fixed his place in history. Myth magnified it. Together, they ensured that Simón Bolívar would remain not just remembered, but continually reinterpreted, an unfinished figure in an unfinished story, still shaping the questions long after the battles have ended.